Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Infinite Monkeys podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you are new here, or if this came across your RSS feed because you're subscribed to the Purple Journal podcast, which is a Vikings podcast I do with Joe Oberle and Joe Johnson every week, and we talk Vikings, welcome. This is going to be something a little different than what you may be used to. The Infinite Monkeys podcast is a podcast that talks about sports in a much more abstract and theoretical way. We don't talk about player evaluations here, who should beat who, or anything like that. We speak about football theory, what to do abstractly on fourth down, how to approach the draft or the free agent market. And to do this, we call on mathematical, economical, and philosophical concepts that aren't usually applied to sports. So today, we are going to ask a question that I think people ask a lot, and the answer is kind of implicit, but not really that well understood. Today we're going to ask, why didn't anybody tank in Week 17? Week 17 every year is filled with a whole bunch of games that are, for all intents and purposes, meaningless. There are a lot of teams who are completely out of playoff contention and really have no reason to win. Or, to put it a different way, winning carries no equity for them. Say you are a 5-10 team going into a Week 17 game. Obviously, this game doesn't matter. You're out of playoff contention. What's the difference between being 6-10 and 5-11? Either way, you didn't make the playoffs. Since the ultimate goal of the season is to make the playoffs and win the Super Bowl, and you are completely locked out of that no matter what happens in this game, it really doesn't matter what happens to you. The only difference between a 5-11 team and a 6-10 team is draft position. A 5-11 team actually ends up having more equity because they have a higher draft pick, and that's worth more. That's tangible and quantifiable. There's a whole bunch of theories out there in like Harvard papers and everything. When you talk about like tangible and quantifiable value, winning that meaningless Week 17 game offers you nothing. It just gets you closer to a playoffs that you weren't going to make anyways. But losing gives you a better draft position, so technically a loss is objectively and strictly better than a win. So why doesn't anybody actually try to lose those games? Or to put it a different way, if they do try to lose those games on purpose, they would never admit it, so why wouldn't they own up to a strategy that is clearly, objectively, and quantifiably better? To answer this question, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War, and more specifically, a corporation called the RAND Corporation, which was established in 1950. RAND stands for R&D, and the original purpose of the RAND Corporation was to act as a think tank of sorts, and to offer guidance and counsel to the United States Armed Forces. So the source of the intelligence that they would give to the armed forces was from researching other disciplines and fields and like applying something from one science to another science, which of course I love. It's like the whole point of this podcast, and that's amazing. But anyway, there were these two guys named Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher, and there were these two mathematicians that were thinking about cooperation. And they were thinking specifically about prisoners. These prisoners are the focus of the main topic of this podcast, and it's called The Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a name it didn't get until the early 90s. And the prisoner's dilemma works like this. Say you and I commit a pretty heinous crime. This crime is so heinous that there are two charges associated with it, a lesser charge and a greater charge. The lesser charge, the sentence for that is a year in prison. The greater charge is worth 2 years in prison. Obviously, as a collective whole, we want to avoid as much prison time as possible. So they catch us and they put us in separate rooms where we cannot communicate, and they present us a deal. Right now, they have enough evidence to just convict us on the lesser charge. So we would essentially be taking a plea deal where we each serve 1 year in prison and 2 total. If we were to squeal on each other and then get each other convicted of the greater charge, we would each serve 2 years in prison and 4 total. So obviously that's worse. But here's the rub. They tell us that if one of us squeals and the other one tries to stay silent, the one who squealed gets to go off free, and the one who stayed silent is going to get 3 years in prison, which is the worst punishment of all. So not knowing what I'm going to do, are you going to squeal, or are you going to stay silent? Well, if we were able to communicate, the answer would be very easy, right? If one of us squeals and the other stays silent, then 3 total years are served, all of them going to one person. If we both squeal, that's the worst option, right? Because we serve 4 years total, so clearly we should stay silent and only serve 2 years between the two of us. But, because we aren't allowed to communicate, we have to behave a little bit differently. We have to serve our own selfish goals. So for a second, say you can assume that you trust me and I will stay silent. If you also stay silent, you'll serve a year. But if you squeal and you betray me, you're going to get off scot-free. So in the case that I stay silent, it's better for you to squeal. Now, in the case that you don't trust me and you think I'm going to squeal on you, well, if you stay silent, you're going to serve 3 years. But if you squeal back on me, you're only going to serve 2. So in both scenarios, whether or not I squeal or stay silent, it makes the most sense for you to squeal on me. And, assuming that both of us are rational decision makers, we're both going to use that logic, end up squealing on each other, and actually take the worst option of all. So when it comes to teams tanking in Week 17, we can kind of use the same logic, or the basic concept that despite the general guise of teamwork in football, everybody's going to be looking out for numero uno first. And really, can you blame them? Nobody wants to be that one guy that ended up trying to stay silent and getting the 3-year sentence. Take coaches, for example. Coaches constantly have their job status riding on their general success, which most prominently is based on wins and losses. So, even if the game is meaningless to playoff position, it may be very meaningful to that coach trying to get a win and give himself a better chance of keeping his job. Players have contract incentives built into their contracts that are based on performance. So, for example, if you get this many sacks or tackles, you get this many $1,000. They may even have incentives built into their contracts that are predicated on specifically wins and losses. So it would behoove those players to give their best effort despite the fact that it doesn't actually matter for playoff position specifically and may have a detrimental long-term effect. If a player doesn't have a contract with incentives built into it, they may be toward the end of a contract, or they may be on a very short contract, and maybe they're trying to put good tape out there for their own purposes so that another team can maybe put tape of them on and be more incentivized to offer that player a good contract. Even players who are maybe on long-term and very safe deals without contract incentives specifically riding on this game, and players who aren't really in any danger of losing anything if they lose a meaningless Week 17 game, are still going to be incentivized to put forth their best effort because of all of the other players on the team who are putting forth their best effort because of contract incentives or job stability or whatever. They don't want to be the one player who didn't try. They don't want to be the guy who tried to stay silent and then got the 3-year sentence. And there really is a punishment for selfish reasons for tanking. The media is going to absolutely crucify you. And perhaps they will erroneously crucify you, right? Maybe they aren't supposed to be vilifying people who just play for the long term instead of the meaningless short term. But there's really nothing you can do about that as a player, right? You know, and it's pretty predictable how they're going to react if they find out that you were tanking, so your best option is not to tank. Perhaps this highlights a fundamental issue in NFL culture, this kind of win-or-die mentality that's preventing bad teams from ever escaping from the cellar of being bad. Perhaps if 60 to 70 people, including players and coaches and all the staff, all got together and said, hey, let's play for the long term, perhaps they would eventually find that long-term success. And if they could just ignore the ire of the fans for a couple of years, which in theory doesn't really sound that hard, they could set their team up in a much better way than if they were in constant quote-unquote win-now mode. A lot of people are talking about the Browns as a team who maybe is employing this strategy, and part of that is because they hired the guy who was Jonah Hill in the movie Moneyball, but part of that is because they've actually been taking a very analytics-driven strategy. However, you still saw the Browns playing the Steelers very hard all the way through overtime, trying to win a meaningless game to bring them to 2-14 instead of 1-15. And winning that game would have had a very significant consequence of costing the Browns the first overall pick in the draft, which has huge value to it. Anyways, thank you guys so much again for listening. Again, if this just popped up on your RSS feed because you're a Purple Journal subscriber, thank you so much for subscribing to that too, and I hope that you are interested in Infinite Monkeys podcasts in the future. I know that I've done this 2 weeks in a row, but I still am not going to promise that I'm going to do this every week. Because I still want to write articles, and I don't think that with my current schedule, I do have a full-time job. I don't think I'd be able to handle both. But, bottom line, these are really fun, and I'm going to try to continue to do them throughout the off-season at whatever regularity that I feel like. At any rate, thank you guys again for listening to the Infinite Monkeys podcast, and I'll see you next time.